Hi, I'm Karoliina, and I'll be talking about joint work with Boker on history determinism and good for gameness in quantitative automata. History deterministic and good for games automata are two intermediate models between deterministic and non-deterministic automata. The idea of studying such models is that sometimes they can combine good algorithmic properties of deterministic automata with some of the expressive power of non-determinism. In the omega regular setting, history determinism and good for gameness are interchangeable as they coincide. However, as we shall see, in the quantitative setting, this is no longer the case, and that is what we explore in this talk, and also the applications of the various notions that ensue to different versions of the quantitative synthesis problem. Let's first agree on what exactly quantitative automata are, at least for the purpose of this talk. They are automata which have some weights over their transitions. Our automata are also equipped with a function that aggregates a sequence of weights into a value. Depending on whether we are on finite or infinite words, the sequence of weights might be finite or infinite. For example, we might consider the supremum of weights, here the sum of weights, the average of weights. Over infinite words, we might look at lim, average, lim sup, discounted sums, and so on and so forth. Then every run produces a sequence of weights, and our aggregator function aggregates that sequence into a single value, the value of the run. Then, since our automaton has non-determinism, we interpret that as the supremum over the runs. For example, in this automaton, the non-deterministic choice consists of either staying in the initial state or moving into the second state that processes A's with weight 1 until the next B is C. So each run of this automaton counts the length of some A block. The supremum over runs is then the longest A block in the finite word. So this automaton associates every word with the length of its longest A block. In this paper, we also consider alternating automata, where in addition to non-deterministic choices, we have universal choices. Since non-determinism is interpreted as the supremum, then universality is interpreted as the dual inference. This means that the semantics of an automaton is given by a game between a maximizing player and a minimizing player. When this game is determined, that gives the value of the game, gives us the value of a word. History determinism, intuitively, corresponds to automata where the non-determinism can be resolved on the fly without looking at the future of the word. In other words, it only depends on the past. More formally, we say that an automaton is history deterministic if there is a resolver, that is, a function, which, given the run so far and the next letter, tells us the next transition to take. In this way, this function builds a run letter by letter over a word. So for each word, it induces a run, and it is a resolver if the value of this run corresponds to the value of the word. Equivalently, we can understand the resolver as a winning strategy for Eve in the following letter game, where Adam plays input letters and Eve has to respond with transitions over these letters, thus building a run over the word given by Adam. Eve wins if the value of the run she has built is exactly the value of the word that Adam has built. Why we care about history determinism is that, well, it is more powerful than determinism. In particular, it can be more expressive. This is, for example, the case for history deterministic push-down automata, which are more expressive than deterministic push-down automata. History determinism can also be more succinct than determinism. This is already the case for Kobuhi automata in the regular setting, which extends easily to lim-inf automata in the quantitative setting. Despite this additional expressivity, history deterministic automata often behave like deterministic ones. In particular, they are what we call good for games. This leads us to our second important definition of the talk. While history determinism talks about non-determinism being resolvable without knowing the future, composition with good for gameness corresponds to composition with games being well behaved. So we say that an automaton is good for games if we can compose it with games in the same way we would compose deterministic automata. Let's see what that means in a little bit more detail. Since we're in the quantitative setting, we talk about quantitative games. In these, we have two players who move on an arena, and every move produces a letter. So a play constructs a word, which might be finite or infinite. The value of the play is then given by the value of the word according to some function that is conveniently implemented by a quantitative automaton. Eve tries to maximize and Adam tries to minimize. If the game is determined, then it has a value. For example, here we can consider a game where Adam owns the boxes, Eve owns the circles, and Eve is trying to maximize the length of A blocks, as in this function given by the automaton we saw earlier. I'll let you pause the video to try to work out the value of this game. When we compose games with automata, this is what we mean. We take the product of the game, the arena, and the state space of the automaton. We still have moves in the game which produce letters, and the automaton processes these letters, and since we have non-determinism, there might be several possible transitions for each move. We allow Eve to resolve that non-determinism by picking a suitable transition over the letter. Now, if our automaton is alternating, we will also have universal choices, which we give to Adam to resolve. Then a play consists of both a word from the original game and a run over that word in the automaton. The value of the play is the value of the run as given by the automaton, and again, Eve is trying to maximize and Adam is trying to minimize. So in this game, Eve has to both build a word in the original automaton and a good run over that word that produces that high value. Then we say that A is good for games if for all such quantitative games with a payoff function given by our automaton, the original game and the composition have the same value. I'll assume for simplicity that the original game is determined. So, as an exercise to the listener, we can look at the product of the game we saw earlier, which has value 3, with the automaton that recognizes the payoff function. I'll let you pause the video to check that if you compose this game with this automaton, the value of the composition is still 3. So in this case, the composition has preserved the value. However, this is not always the case. In particular, I'll let you check that in this second game, which has value 2, in the composition, the value is only 1. So Eve loses out when we take the composition of this game with this automaton. Note that if an automaton is history deterministic, then it is also good for games, as the resolver gives Eve a strategy that she can follow in the automaton component of the composition that guarantees that she achieves the same value as she does in the original game. We can conclude that this example automaton is definitely not good for games. Indeed, here the non-deterministic choice depends on knowing when the longest A block is going to occur. Why we care about good for gameness? Well, Taking the composition of a game with an automaton allows us to reduce solving games with a payoff given by an automaton. So this can be a fairly arbitrary function, for example, the length of the longest A block. We can reduce such games to games with very standard winning conditions, such as the sum, the discounted sum, the infimum, the supremum, and so on and so forth. In other words, we might not have an off-the-shelf algorithm for solving games where one player tries to maximize the length of A blocks. However, we do have off-the-shelf algorithms for solving some games. So if our automaton is good for games, that allows us to do this reduction. Now, in the omega regular setting, history determinism and good for gameness, although the definitions are different, they still coincide, and the proof is very simple. So when we tried to extend these notions to the quantitative setting, we tried to copy this lemma and prove it in the quantitative setting. However, we ran into a slight issue, namely the following counterexample. Here, we have a non-deterministic choice to either go to a state that assigns value 1 to all letters, or to go to a state that assigns a high value to A and a low value to B. We can see this as a sum automaton, for example, but it could be a sub-automaton, or we can adapt this example to nearly any value function as long as we have 3 distinct values. So this is clearly not history deterministic, as to resolve the non-determinism, we essentially have to guess the second letter. However, it is good for games. So observe that the function that this automaton recognizes or computes is the one that assigns 2 to words where the second letter is an A, and 1 to words where the second letter is B. Now, if we compose it with a game that has value 1, then Eve can use the knowledge that the game has value 1 to carelessly go into this upper state from where she knows that she can get value 1, whatever happens in the game. On the other hand, if the game has value 2, well, that means that Eve can guarantee that the second letter is going to be an A with a strategy in the game. Then, in the composition, she can go into the lower state to achieve value 2, also in the composition. So what is happening here is that the game that we compose with gives Eve some extra information that she can use to resolve the non-determinism, which she wouldn't be able to do just in the letter game, where the next letter can be arbitrary. In other words, the game gives us a threshold value that Eve can aim for. So this led us to define the notions of threshold history determinism and threshold good for gameness, which parameterize the notion of history determinism with a threshold. And here the important aspect is that in threshold history determinism, we can have a different resolver for every different threshold. So then we have all of these different notions in between deterministic and non-deterministic automata, and we can ask how they relate to each other. So adding thresholds to good for gameness does not make a difference, essentially because the value of the game is already a kind of threshold. However, the example we showed you in the previous slide showed that history determinism and threshold history determinism is not the same thing. Namely, it is easier to be threshold history deterministic, as the resolver can be different for each distinct threshold. Threshold history determinism implies threshold good for gameness in the same way that history determinism implies good for gameness. The other direction is less straightforward, and we could show that the other direction holds whenever this letter game, where Adam plays letters and Eve responds with transitions, is determined. We could show this determinacy for inf automata, sub automata, lim inf, lim sub, and discounted sum, as well as finite word automata. So in all of these cases, there is an equivalence between threshold history determinism and good for gameness. However, in general, this might not hold, but we do not have a counterexample either. We then also considered determinisability by pruning, which asks whether the automaton contains an equivalent deterministic automaton. For non-deterministic automata, it implies history determinism. However, this is not the case for alternating automata, already for a Boolean automata. The other direction also does not hold unless our value function satisfies some very specific criteria. And in the paper, we explore those criteria in more detail and are able to show that for various value functions, these do in fact coincide. Adding thresholds to determinisability by pruning also gives us a more permissive definition, where we also have strict containment, while history determinism remains incomparable. So once we have all of these different notions and the relations between them, we can ask, well, which ones of these notions are interesting? Why should we care, for example, about history determinism or threshold history determinism? Well, history determinism implies good for games, which we know is useful for well-solving games. However, good for gameness, the definition asks about compositionality with all possible games, which might include, for example, infinite games, and is not obvious how you might approach deciding that. However, to decide history determinism, we just have to figure out how to solve this letter game for a particular value function. I would also argue that history determinism is quite a natural definition that is interesting in its own right. However, we can also find some applications in versions of the quantitative synthesis problem. So recall that the quantitative synthesis problem can be seen as a game between an environment player and a system player, where the environment plays input words to which the system has to respond. The overall behavior has some value given by our quantitative automaton to represent the costs, the rewards, the utility or the battery usage, the energy usage of the system behavior. Then we can ask several possible questions. For example, we can ask, what value can the system guarantee? This is a very natural generalization of the church synthesis problem. However, it is fairly limited in that it only cares about the worst case scenario in which the environment is completely antagonistic. And in particular, it allows the system to play suboptimally whenever the environment does not behave in the worst possible way. We might therefore be interested in a slightly different version of the synthesis problem, called the best value synthesis problem, in which we ask whether a system can guarantee that for all inputs, it produces an output that is optimal, in the sense that it has the best value of any output when paired with that input. So this is known as the best value synthesis problem, and we can also consider both of these problems with a threshold, where we care about whether the system achieves some threshold. So we know that to solve the first synthesis problem, this reduces to solving a quantitative game, finding out the value of the quantitative game. And therefore we know that if our automaton is good for games, this is easy to solve. To solve the second problem, this is not quite so straightforward. However, it turns out that solving the best value synthesis problem of a deterministic quantitative automaton is exactly the same thing as deciding history determinism of a non-deterministic quantitative automaton of the same type. So this motivates the problem of studying how to decide history determinism and also the complexity of resolvers. Indeed, when we take the composition of the game, we don't really care about the complexity of the resolver, which does not influence the complexity of solving the game, nor the complexity of the strategies. However, here the complexity of the resolver corresponds exactly to the solution to the best value synthesis, which corresponds to the implementation of our system, and therefore the complexity does matter very much. This leads us to conclude. So in this paper, we extend various notions, history determinism, good for gameness, determinisability by pruning, into the quantitative setting. We argue that both the plain version and the threshold versions are interesting. We study how they relate to each other and when these notions coincide, and then we consider how they relate to various versions of the quantitative synthesis problem. Thank you very much. I'll be available for questions.